The storm that blotted out Chicago in 1967 and exposed the urban chaos of post-war America. On the morning of January 24, 1967, Chicago was warm. Not just comfortable, warm. The thermometer climbed to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and people walked along Michigan Avenue in light jackets, some even in shirt sleeves. Children played in the parks. Office workers ate their lunches outside, sitting on benches near the Chicago River, watching the grey water flow beneath bridges that would soon become impassable. The city hummed with its usual rhythm. Factories along the south side churned out steel and machinery. The elevated trains rattled through neighborhoods where immigrants from a dozen countries had built lives from nothing. Taxis honked in the loop. Secretaries clattered on typewriters. Somewhere in Bridgeport, a young mother hung laundry on a line, grateful for the unexpected warmth. No one knew. They could not have known. 48 hours later, that same city would vanish beneath 23 inches of snow. The greatest single snowfall in Chicago's recorded history would descend without adequate warning, trapping hundreds of thousands of people in their offices, their schools, their cars. The metropolis that had rebuilt itself from fire, that had survived the stockyard strikes and the Great Depression, that had emerged from 2 world wars as the beating industrial heart of America, would be brought to its knees by frozen water falling from the sky. But this is not simply a story about weather. It is a story about what happens when nature tests the systems we build, the cities we inhabit, the assumptions we hold about progress and control. The blizzard of 1967 did more than paralyze Chicago. It exposed the fragile architecture of post-war urban America, revealing the cracks that prosperity had papered over, the divisions that progress had ignored, the illusion that a modern city could master every challenge through sheer force of will. The storm came on a Thursday. It left behind questions that would take decades to answer. Think of Chicago in January 1967 as a city caught between 2 versions of itself. One version was the gleaming downtown that Mayor Richard Daley had spent 12 years building. New expressways sliced through old neighborhoods, carrying suburban commuters into a revitalized loop where glass towers were rising alongside the old stone banks and department stores. The Civic Center was under construction, soon to be crowned by a monumental sculpture from Pablo Picasso himself. O'Hare International Airport, already the busiest in the world, was expanding again. The city that works, people called it. Daley's Chicago, a machine that ran on patronage and ambition, and the unwavering belief that any problem could be solved if you knew the right people and had enough muscle to push it through. The other version was less visible, but no less real. This was the Chicago of cramped apartments in the Black Belt, where families who had migrated from Mississippi and Alabama a generation earlier still waited for the promises of the North to materialize. It was the Chicago of Polish neighborhoods on the northwest side, where old men gathered in taverns and worried that the expressways carving up their streets would destroy communities their grandparents had built. It was the Chicago of young mothers in Lawndale, watching their children walk to underfunded schools, past buildings that landlords had abandoned. It was the Chicago that Martin Luther King Jr. had visited the previous summer, marching through Marquette Park, while white crowds threw bottles and screamed epithets that reminded everyone how thin the veneer of northern liberalism really was. These 2 Chicagos existed in uneasy proximity, their fates intertwined but their experiences profoundly different. And on the morning of January 26th, both versions would face the same storm. What they encountered in its aftermath would reveal which Chicago was real and which was merely a story the powerful told themselves. The first flakes began falling at 5:02 in the morning. Most of the city was still asleep. Night shift workers at the steel mills noticed the snow drifting past the sodium lights, but they had seen snow before. This was Chicago, after all. Snow was simply part of the landscape, an inconvenience that the city's army of plows and salt trucks would handle as they always had. By 7 o'clock, 7. As the early risers switched on their radios and poured their first cups of coffee, the accumulation had already reached 2 inches. The forecasters spoke of 4 to 6 inches total, perhaps a bit more on the lakefront. Nothing unusual. People bundled up their children and sent them to school. They kissed their spouses goodbye and headed for the bus stops and train platforms. They started their cars and pulled out of driveways, windshield wipers slapping rhythmically against the thickening fall. The city's transit system groaned into motion. 800 Chicago Transit Authority buses fanned out across the metropolitan area, their tires hissing through the growing slush. The elevated trains, running on electricity rather than gasoline, seemed immune to the weather, their cars swaying above streets that were beginning to turn white. Commuters packed themselves into subway cars and read their morning papers, oblivious to what was building above them. In the offices of the National Weather Service, forecasters watched their instruments with growing concern. The storm was not behaving as predicted. Instead of weakening as it moved north, it was intensifying. Moisture was streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico, colliding with the Arctic air that had swept down from Canada. Lake Michigan was adding its own contribution. The relatively warm water feeding the storm system like fuel poured onto a fire. By 9 o'clock, the revised forecast called for 12 to 16 inches, but the warning came too late for the hundreds of thousands of people already on their way to work. Picture the scene at noon on January 26th. 8 inches of snow have fallen, and it is still coming down at a rate of 2 inches per hour. The wind has picked up, gusting to 40 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontally across streets and highways. Visibility has dropped to near zero in some areas. The temperature is falling rapidly, transforming the wet snow on the roads into a treacherous glaze of ice beneath the fresh powder. On the expressways, traffic has stopped, not slowed, stopped. The Dan Ryan, the Eisenhower, the Kennedy, Lakeshore Drive, all of them have become parking lots of stranded vehicles, their engines running uselessly as drivers wait for help that is not coming. Some people have abandoned their cars and begun walking, heads bowed against the wind, searching for warmth and shelter. Others remain in their vehicles, not knowing what else to do, watching the snow pile up around them until their cars become white mounds, indistinguishable from the drifts. The city buses are in even worse trouble. Unlike private automobiles, they cannot simply pull over and wait. Their schedules demand constant motion, picking up passengers at designated stops, maintaining the rhythm of urban life. But the rhythm has broken. Buses are getting stuck at intersections, their rear wheels spinning uselessly on the ice. Other buses are stopping behind them, creating chains of immobilized transit vehicles that block entire streets. By mid-afternoon, more than 800 CTA buses will be stranded across the city, some with passengers still aboard, waiting in the cold for rescue that might take hours to arrive. And still the snow falls. In the Loop, the situation is becoming desperate. Office buildings that normally empty at 5 o'clock are filling instead with workers who cannot leave. The elevators run up and down, carrying people who peer out at the white chaos beyond the windows and decide to wait a little longer, hoping the storm will let up. The restaurants and coffee shops are overwhelmed, their supplies dwindling as they struggle to feed crowds that should have gone home hours ago. Hotels begin reporting that their rooms are full, booked by stranded travelers and commuters who have given up on reaching their suburban homes. The train stations are worse. Union Station and the Northwestern Terminal are packed with thousands of commuters whose trains are not running. The tracks are buried, the switches are frozen. Even the locomotives, those massive machines that had conquered the American continent, are helpless against the drifting snow. People crowd onto benches and lean against walls, sharing cigarettes and stories. Strangers united by the common predicament of being stuck in a city that has suddenly become a prison. O'Hare Airport closed at noon, stranding 10,000 travelers who had expected to be in New York or Los Angeles or Miami by dinner time. Midway followed shortly after. The runways were invisible beneath 10-foot drifts, and even if they could be cleared, no pilot would risk a landing in visibility that had dropped to less than a quarter mile. By evening, the city of Chicago had effectively ceased to function. The snow continued through the night and into Friday morning, finally tapering off around 10 o'clock after depositing 23 inches across the metropolitan area. Drifts in some locations reached 15 feet. Streets that had carried traffic just 24 hours earlier were now impassable canyons of white, the abandoned cars buried so completely that their locations could only be guessed at by the slight mounds in the otherwise smooth surface. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, consider doing so now. This story is far from over, and the lessons it teaches about our cities, our assumptions, and our capacity to face the unexpected have never been more relevant. Join us as we continue to uncover what the blizzard of 1967 revealed about America. When the sky finally cleared on Friday afternoon, Chicagoans emerged from their homes and offices to confront a transformed world. The familiar landmarks were still there, the Wrigley Building and the Tribune Tower, the Prudential Building and the old water tower that had survived the Great Fire. But everything else had changed. The streets were buried, the sidewalks were impassable, the automobiles that defined post-war American mobility had become useless objects, entombed in white. The immediate crisis was one of basic survival. People needed food, they needed medicine, they needed heat. And for tens of thousands of Chicagoans, getting to these necessities meant navigating a landscape that had suddenly become hostile to human movement. Consider the diabetics, who required insulin injections to survive. The pharmacies were closed or inaccessible. The hospitals were overwhelmed. In the hours after the storm, helicopters from the National Guard began flying emergency missions across the city, delivering insulin and other critical medications to patients who would have died without them. It was an image that captured the strange new reality. In the most technologically advanced nation on Earth, in one of its greatest cities, people were being kept alive by aircraft because the streets had become unusable. Or consider the pregnant women whose labor began during the storm. Ambulances could not reach them. Private cars were useless. In neighborhoods across Chicago, women gave birth at home, attended by neighbors who had some memory of how such things were done before the era of sterile hospital delivery rooms. Others were transported to hospitals by the only vehicles that could move through the drifts: snowplows, city salt trucks. In one case, a bulldozer was pressed into service, the laboring woman wrapped in blankets and placed in the bucket, bouncing toward the emergency room as the machine churned through snow that would have stopped any ordinary vehicle. These were stories of improvisation and courage, of neighbors helping neighbors, of the fundamental human capacity to adapt when the systems we depend on break down. But they were also stories that exposed how fragile those systems had become, how dependent the modern American city was on technologies and infrastructures that could be disabled by nothing more exotic than frozen water. Mayor Richard Daley had built his reputation on making Chicago work. The patronage system that he commanded ensured that trash was collected, streets were paved, and city services functioned with reasonable efficiency. The machine he controlled was not elegant or idealistic, but it delivered results that voters could see and appreciate. And Daley himself was a tireless worker, arriving at City Hall before dawn and staying long past dark, personally monitoring the performance of every department under his command. But the blizzard of 1967 challenged even Daley's formidable capacity for control. The city's snow removal equipment, substantial by any normal measure, was overwhelmed. The plows could clear a street, but the wind would fill it in again within hours. The salt trucks could treat the main arteries, but there was not enough salt in Chicago to treat every side street and alley. And the manpower, even with every city worker pressed into service, was simply inadequate to the scale of the disaster. Daley responded with characteristic aggression. He ordered city employees to work around the clock. He commandeered private equipment from construction companies. He called the governors of neighboring states and requested assistance. Iowa sent snowplows. Wisconsin sent trucks. Michigan sent heavy equipment and the operators to run it. It was an unprecedented mobilization of resources, a testament to Daley's political connections and his willingness to call in every favor he had accumulated over decades in power. But it was not enough, not immediately. For 3 days, Chicago remained paralyzed, its streets impassable, its economy frozen, its millions of residents improvising their way through a crisis that no amount of political muscle could instantly resolve. The economic impact was staggering. Businesses lost an estimated $150 million in those 3 days, the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in today's currency. Factories that had been running 3 shifts sat silent. Retail stores in the Loop, usually packed with shoppers, stood empty because no one could reach them. The commodity exchanges suspended trading, the courts closed, the entire apparatus of commerce ground to a halt. But the deeper damage was harder to quantify. For many Chicagoans, the blizzard shattered the comfortable assumption that modern urban life was somehow insulated from nature's power. They had believed, perhaps without even articulating the belief, that the city they lived in was a triumph of human engineering over the natural world. The expressways and elevated trains, the skyscrapers and airports, the dense networks of commerce and communication that made Chicago a world city, all of these had seemed to represent a kind of mastery, a declaration that human civilization had reached a stage where the old vulnerabilities no longer applied. The blizzard disproved this assumption with brutal simplicity. 23 inches of snow, driven by 40-mile-per-hour winds, had accomplished what no human enemy could have achieved. It had stopped Chicago cold. The cleanup began in earnest on Saturday, as the storm system finally moved east and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 3 days. But progress was agonizingly slow. The scale of the snowfall overwhelmed every available resource. Streets that normally took an hour to clear required entire days. The abandoned cars, buried under feet of snow, had to be located and excavated before the plows could even begin their work. And even when a street was cleared, there was nowhere to put the snow. City trucks began hauling it to the Chicago River and dumping it in, a practice that would later be banned for environmental reasons, but that seemed like the only option at the time. In some neighborhoods, the city's efforts were supplemented by spontaneous acts of collective action. Men emerged from their homes with shovels and formed teams, working their way down their blocks, digging out sidewalks and clearing paths to the street. Women organized meal schedules, cooking for the work crews and for elderly neighbors who could not fend for themselves. Children, freed from school and delighted by the adventure of it all, tunneled through the drifts and built snow forts from material that seemed inexhaustible. These scenes of communal effort were heartening, and they would be remembered fondly in the years that followed. But they also revealed something troubling about the city's official response. In the wealthier neighborhoods, on the North Shore and in the western suburbs, the plows came quickly, and the roads were cleared within days. In the poorer neighborhoods, on the south side and in the west side ghettos, the wait was much longer. Streets that carried buses serving working-class commuters remained impassable for a week or more. Alleys where the garbage trucks could not pass became impromptu dumps, their trash frozen into the snowbanks. This disparity was not lost on those who experienced it. The blizzard had not created the inequalities in Chicago's geography of resources and attention, but it had exposed them with unusual clarity, making visible patterns that the normal rhythms of city life tended to obscure. In the Black Belt, where hundreds of thousands of African Americans lived in some of the most densely packed housing in America, the storm's aftermath was particularly harsh. These neighborhoods had already been neglected by a city administration that directed its resources toward the white ethnic wards that formed the base of Daley's political support. The public housing projects, which were supposed to provide decent shelter for the poor, had become vertical slums, their elevators broken, their hallways dangerous, their grounds unattended. When the snow came, these same neighborhoods found themselves at the end of the queue for city services. The contrast was impossible to miss. On the Gold Coast, wealthy residents watched from their high-rise windows as city crews worked around the clock to clear the streets below. In Lawndale, families huddled in unheated apartments because the delivery trucks carrying heating oil could not reach them. On the Magnificent Mile, shop owners shoveled their sidewalks and prepared for the return of customers. In Woodlawn, children played in streets that would not see a plow for days, their parents wondering when the buses would run again so they could get to work. These disparities had existed before the storm, of course. The geography of inequality in Chicago was decades in the making, the product of redlining and restrictive covenants, of political decisions and economic forces that had concentrated poverty in certain neighborhoods while channeling wealth to others. But the blizzard made these patterns newly visible, stripping away the daily routines that allowed both privileged and disadvantaged Chicagoans to ignore the distance between their worlds. And in the months that followed, as the city slowly returned to normal, the memory of that disparity would linger. For some, it became one more grievance in a long list, one more example of how the machine that was supposed to serve all Chicagoans actually served some far better than others. The groundwork was being laid, though no one knew it yet, for the upheavals that would shake the city in the years to come. Leave a comment now with the phrase, "This story touched me deeply." If this narrative has moved you, if you recognize in these scenes something true about our cities and our humanity, share that feeling with us. Your comment tells us that these stories matter, that the effort to remember and understand is worthwhile. The immediate crisis of the blizzard lasted about a week. By the beginning of February, the main streets were clear, the buses were running, and most Chicagoans had returned to their routines. The abandoned cars had been towed, the expressways reopened, the airports resumed operations. On the surface, the city had recovered, but the recovery was incomplete. On February 1st, another 4 inches of snow fell on Chicago. On February 5th, another 8.5 inches. The ground, already saturated with the remains of the January storm, could not absorb any more. Snow was piled everywhere, on the sidewalks, in the vacant lots, along the curbs. The accumulation reached 27 inches at one point, the deepest snow cover in Chicago's history. The winter of 1966 to 1967 would ultimately deposit more than 68 inches of snow on the city, shattering the previous seasonal record. Spring seemed impossibly distant. The white landscape that had seemed novel in late January became oppressive by mid-February. People grew weary of shoveling, of the cold, of the shortened days, and the constant struggle to move through an environment that resisted movement. This extended winter had consequences beyond mere inconvenience. The city's budget was strained by the cost of snow removal. The salt supply, which was supposed to last the entire season, was exhausted and had to be replenished at premium prices. Equipment broke down under the constant use and had to be repaired or replaced. The overtime costs for city workers mounted into the millions. For businesses, the extended winter meant extended losses. The retail sector, which depended on foot traffic and impulse purchases, suffered through weeks of diminished sales. The construction industry, which normally slowed in winter but did not stop completely, found itself unable to work at all. The hospitality industry saw conventions cancelled and bookings drop as visitors decided to postpone their Chicago trips until the weather improved. And for ordinary workers, the winter brought a different kind of hardship. Many had lost days or weeks of wages during the blizzard and its aftermath, time that could not be recovered. The hourly employees and day laborers who made up a significant portion of Chicago's workforce had no sick leave, no paid time off, no cushion against the unexpected. When they could not get to work, they simply did not get paid. When their employers could not open, there was no work to be had. The storm had revealed how precarious life could be for those living close to the margin. Mayor Daley emerged from the crisis with his reputation largely intact. His aggressive response to the emergency, his visible presence at City Hall coordinating the cleanup, his successful appeals for outside assistance. All of these demonstrated the qualities that had made him Chicago's dominant political figure. Voters saw a leader who had faced an unprecedented challenge and met it with determination and competence. When Daley ran for re-election later that year, he won easily, his fourth consecutive term in an unbroken tenure that would eventually stretch to 21 years. But the blizzard had planted seeds of doubt that would eventually bear fruit. The disparity in services between neighborhoods, so visible during the crisis, became a political issue that Daley's opponents would exploit in years to come. The limitations of the machine, its inability to adapt quickly to unexpected challenges, its reliance on established patterns that broke down under stress, these became apparent to observers who had previously accepted the machine's efficiency as a given. And the city itself had learned something about its own vulnerability. The expressways that had seemed like monuments to progress were revealed as liabilities when the weather turned bad. The suburban sprawl that depended on automobile travel proved far more fragile than the dense urban neighborhoods where people could walk to the stores and the L trains ran above the snow. The very technologies that had made Chicago a modern city had also made it susceptible to disruptions that older, simpler cities would have shrugged off. This awareness would shape debates about urban planning and infrastructure for years to come. The blizzard became a case study in the textbooks, an example of how natural disasters expose the weaknesses in built environments. Planners began to think more carefully about redundancy, about alternative routes and backup systems, about designing cities that could maintain basic functions even when some of their components failed. The lessons of January 1967 rippled outward through the profession, influencing decisions in cities across the country. But the most profound lesson of the blizzard was not technical. It was human. The storm had revealed that beneath the sophisticated machinery of urban life, Chicagoans were still connected to each other by bonds that no amount of technology could replace. The neighbors who helped each other dig out, the strangers who shared food and warmth, the communities that pulled together when the official systems broke down. These were not anomalies. They were the foundation on which the city actually rested, the substrate of human connection that made urban life possible. This realization cut both ways. On one hand, it was reassuring to discover that people would help each other in a crisis, that the anonymity of city life had not completely eroded the instincts of mutual aid. On the other hand, it raised uncomfortable questions about why such aid was necessary, about why the systems that were supposed to provide for everyone's needs had failed so dramatically. The warmth of neighborly assistance could not disguise the cold reality that some neighborhoods had been abandoned to fend for themselves, while others received prompt and adequate support. The urban chaos that the blizzard exposed was not a natural phenomenon. It was a human creation, the product of decisions made over decades about where to invest and where to neglect, who to include and who to exclude, which communities mattered and which could be overlooked. The storm merely made these decisions visible. It fell equally on rich and poor, on black and white, on the connected and the isolated, but the aftermath was not equal at all. In the years that followed, Chicago would struggle with these inequalities, sometimes making progress, sometimes falling back. The civil rights movement would continue to press for change, and the city would experience moments of hope and periods of despair. The machine that Daley had built would endure for a time, then weaken, then re-emerge in new forms. The neighborhoods that had been neglected would fight for recognition, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The city that had been paralyzed by snow would face other challenges, economic and social and political, that would test its resilience in different ways. But the blizzard remained in memory, a shared experience that bound generations of Chicagoans together. Those who lived through it never forgot the white world that had descended without warning, the strange silence of the buried streets, the faces of neighbors seen for the first time as they worked together to restore some semblance of normal life. The storm became part of the city's mythology, a story passed down from parents to children, from old-timers to newcomers, a reminder of what had happened and what could happen again. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the blizzard of 1967. Nature does not respect our schedules or our assumptions. It operates by rules we cannot fully control, and it can disrupt our most elaborate preparations with casual ease. The cities we build, the systems we create, the lives we construct, all of these exist within a larger context of forces that we can influence but never master. To forget this is to invite disaster. To remember it is to approach the future with appropriate humility. Chicago forgot, and then remembered, and then carried on. That is what cities do. That is what people do. We build and we rebuild. We suffer and we recover. We fall down and we get back up. The snow that buried Chicago in January 1967 eventually melted. As all snow does, the streets reopened, the buses ran again, life resumed its familiar patterns, but something had changed, something subtle but real, a shift in understanding that would take years to fully manifest. The storm that blotted out Chicago had also illuminated it, revealing truths that the bright lights of progress had hidden, and those truths would continue to matter long after the last drift had disappeared. 26 people died in Chicago during the blizzard and its immediate aftermath. This number, though significant, does not capture the full human cost of the storm. It counts only the deaths that could be directly attributed to the weather, the heart attacks suffered while shoveling snow, the accidents that occurred on treacherous roads, the exposure victims who were caught outside without adequate shelter. It does not count the more gradual toll, the elderly people whose health declined after days in poorly heated apartments, the chronically ill who missed critical medical appointments, the workers whose lost wages pushed them into debt from which they never recovered. These casualties were real but invisible, deaths and disabilities that official statistics could not capture. The most publicized death was that of a young girl caught in crossfire between police and individuals taking property from abandoned vehicles. This tragedy, which had nothing to do with the weather itself, became a symbol of the disorder that the storm had unleashed. It revealed how quickly the veneer of civilization could crack when the systems of order broke down, how desperation and opportunity could combine to produce violence in a city that prided itself on stability. But most of the deaths were quieter, less dramatic, the predictable consequences of a population caught off guard by a natural event. Men in their 50s and 60s, overweight and sedentary, who insisted on clearing their own driveways and dropped from the exertion, motorists stranded on expressways, running their engines for warmth, succumbing to carbon monoxide poisoning when the exhaust pipes became blocked by snow, pedestrians caught far from shelter, disoriented by the whiteout conditions, collapsing from hypothermia in alleys and vacant lots. Each death was a story, a life interrupted, a family left to grieve. Behind the statistics were wives who waited for husbands who never came home, children who grew up without fathers, parents who buried sons and daughters who should have outlived them. The blizzard was not a war or an epidemic, but it extracted its toll with the same indifferent efficiency. And yet, measured against the scale of the disaster, the death toll was remarkably low. A storm of this magnitude, striking without adequate warning, could easily have killed hundreds. The fact that only 26 died in Chicago itself, and perhaps 60 in the wider metropolitan area, testified to the resilience of the population and the effectiveness of the emergency response. However imperfect it may have been, the comparison to other disasters is instructive. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the previous benchmark for urban catastrophe in the city, killed approximately 300 people and left 100,000 homeless. The blizzard of 1967, though it caused enormous disruption, claimed far fewer lives and left the physical infrastructure of the city largely intact. The snow would melt, the buildings still stood, the streets, once cleared, would carry traffic again. This difference reflected the changes that 96 years of urban development had brought. The Chicago of 1871 was built largely of wood, its streets unpaved, its fire department primitive. The Chicago of 1967 had fireproof construction, professional emergency services, communication networks that allowed warnings to spread quickly, and transportation alternatives that gave people options when one mode of travel failed. Progress had not eliminated vulnerability, but it had reduced it. The blizzard also demonstrated the importance of what modern analysts call social capital, the networks of trust and cooperation that allow communities to function effectively in times of crisis. Chicago in 1967 was not a perfect city, but it was a city where people still knew their neighbors, where ethnic and religious institutions provided support structures beyond the family, where the tradition of mutual aid had not entirely disappeared. In the Polish neighborhoods of the Northwest Side, parish churches opened their doors to stranded travelers and organized feeding programs for the housebound elderly. In the black neighborhoods of the South Side, community organizations that had been formed to fight for civil rights pivoted to disaster relief, distributing food and checking on vulnerable residents. In the Jewish neighborhoods of the West Side, synagogues became warming centers and collection points for donated supplies. These responses were not coordinated by city government. They emerged spontaneously from communities that had developed, over generations, the habits of looking after their own. The blizzard tested these habits and found them strong. Whatever else had changed in post-war America, the capacity for neighbors to help neighbors had not been entirely lost. But the blizzard also revealed the limits of spontaneous mutual aid. The neighborhoods with the strongest social networks were generally the neighborhoods that needed them least. They had adequate housing, reasonable access to services, populations that included professionals and business owners who could mobilize resources quickly. The neighborhoods that needed help most desperately were often the neighborhoods where social networks had been weakened by poverty, by the displacement of urban renewal, by the systematic neglect of institutions that might have provided support. This paradox would become more acute in the years that followed, as Chicago's population continued to shift and the old ethnic neighborhoods that had produced such strong community ties began to change. The machine politics that Daley represented, with its roots in ward organizations and precinct captains, was itself a form of social network, one that could deliver services and solve problems for those who were connected to it. But it was also a system that rewarded loyalty over need, that channeled resources toward supporters and away from those who could not or would not participate. The blizzard had frozen this system in place long enough for its contours to become visible, and what people saw once they looked raised questions that would not go away. The spring of 1967 came late to Chicago, as it always does. The last significant snowfall occurred in mid-March, and the final remnants of the January accumulation did not disappear until early April. By then, the city had long since returned to its normal rhythms, and the blizzard had become a topic for reminiscence rather than urgent concern. But the patterns revealed by the storm did not melt with the snow. The disparities in city services, so visible during the crisis, persisted in less dramatic form during ordinary times. The neighborhoods that had been last to be cleared were also last to have their potholes filled, their streetlights repaired, their garbage collected on schedule. The connections between political power and municipal attention, momentarily illuminated by the emergency, continued to shape the distribution of resources across the city. For Mayor Daley, the blizzard had been a test that he had largely passed. His aggressive response had demonstrated the qualities that voters valued: his energy and determination, his ability to mobilize resources, his willingness to work hard and demand hard work from others. The machine had bent under the stress, but had not broken. The city had survived. But the cracks that the blizzard had exposed would widen in the years ahead. 1967 was not just the year of the Great Snow. It was also a year of racial tension and civil unrest across America, a year when the long hot summer of urban conflict reached cities from Newark to Detroit. Chicago would have its own moment of crisis the following spring, when the death of Martin Luther King Jr. sparked days of destruction on the west side. The fault lines that the blizzard had revealed would erupt in flames, and in 1979 another great storm would test the city, less than a week after Michael Bilandic had taken office as mayor following Daley's death. That blizzard, which dumped less snow than the 1967 storm but caused even greater disruption, would become Bilandic's political undoing. The machine that had weathered so many challenges would finally crack, and Jane Byrne would ride the frustration of stranded commuters and neglected neighborhoods all the way to City Hall. The connection between these events was not coincidental. The blizzard of 1967 had revealed the vulnerabilities that the blizzard of 1979 would exploit. The machine that seemed so strong in January 1967 was actually approaching the end of its era, its foundations eroding even as its facade remained impressive. The snow had shown what was underneath. But in the spring of 1967, none of this was yet apparent. Chicagoans went about their business, grateful that the ordeal was over, not yet aware that it had been a preview of challenges to come. The city that works was working again, and for the moment, that seemed like enough. The summer brought warmth and renewal. Children played in parks that had been buried under snow. Couples walked along the lakefront, where the drifts had piled 15 feet high. The city hummed with its familiar energy, the traffic and the crowds and the endless enterprise of urban life. Chicago had survived the storm, as it had survived so many others. That was the story that most people told themselves, and for the time being it was a story that satisfied. What the blizzard of 1967 ultimately revealed was not unique to Chicago. Every great city carries within it the same tensions and contradictions that the storm had exposed. The gap between the prosperous and the struggling, the connected and the isolated, the served and the neglected. These are universal features of urban life, present in varying degrees wherever millions of people gather to pursue their ambitions and build their lives. But Chicago in 1967 occupied a particular moment in the arc of American urban history. The post-war confidence that had rebuilt cities from the rubble of depression and war was beginning to show its limits. The belief that experts and planners could solve any problem, that growth and prosperity would lift all boats, that the future would be better than the past, these articles of faith were starting to be questioned. The expressways that were supposed to move people efficiently had also divided neighborhoods and displaced communities. The public housing that was supposed to provide decent shelter for the poor had become concentrations of poverty and despair. The urban renewal that was supposed to eliminate blight had often eliminated communities instead, replacing the organic complexity of older neighborhoods with sterile towers and empty plazas. The blizzard did not create these problems, but it made them impossible to ignore, at least for a moment. When the snow buried the expressways, people remembered the neighborhoods that had been destroyed to build them. When the buses could not run, people remembered the streetcar lines that had been ripped out to make way for automobiles. When the poor neighborhoods waited longest for help, people remembered all the other ways those neighborhoods had been waiting for decades for attention that never came. This moment of clarity was brief. Once the streets were clear and normal life resumed, the daily pressures of getting by reasserted themselves, and the larger questions faded into the background, but they did not disappear entirely. They lingered in the consciousness of those who had experienced the storm, ready to resurface when the next crisis came. And crises would come. They always do. The cities we build are never finished, never perfect, never immune to the forces that test them. We can prepare and plan and invest, and still be surprised by what happens next. The blizzard of 1967 was one such surprise, and the lessons it taught about infrastructure and inequality, about community and resilience, about the limits of control and the endurance of hope, remain relevant today. The city that emerged from the snow was the same city that had been there before, and yet it was different. Something had shifted in the collective understanding of what Chicago was and what it could become. The confidence of the post-war era, the belief in endless progress and growing prosperity, had been qualified by the experience of paralysis, by the recognition that even the greatest city could be brought to a halt by nature's indifferent power. This new awareness did not lead immediately to change. Institutions resist change, and the forces that had shaped post-war Chicago The political machine, the real estate interests, the suburban flight, the racial divisions, these continued to operate according to their established logics. But the awareness was there, a seed planted by the storm, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to grow. The world went white on January 26, 1967. For a few days, everything stopped, and then, slowly, life resumed, altered in ways that would take years to fully understand. This is how it always happens. The storm comes, the world changes, and we carry on, shaped by what we have survived but not defined by it. The blizzard of 1967 was not the end of anything or the beginning of anything in particular. It was a moment, a pause in the flow of time, a chance to see clearly what is usually obscured by the busyness of ordinary life. What people saw, in that moment of clarity, was themselves, their city, their neighbors, the systems they had built and the systems that had failed them, the courage that emerged under pressure and the inequalities that persisted regardless of the weather. It was not a simple picture, and it offered no simple lessons, but it was true, and that truth has echoed across the decades since. The snow remembers. It fell once, long ago, and buried a great city, and though it melted in the spring, as all snow does, the memory of that white world has never entirely faded. It lives in the stories that survivors tell, in the photographs preserved in archives, in the way a city thinks about itself and its place in the larger world. Chicago survived the blizzard of 1967, as it has survived every challenge that history has thrown at it. The storm passed, the streets cleared, life went on, but something remained, a residue of experience and understanding, a reminder that the world we build is always provisional, always subject to forces beyond our control, and perhaps that is the final message of the blizzard. Not despair, but humility. Not resignation, but determination tempered by wisdom. We cannot prevent the storms that will come. We can only prepare for them as best we can, and when they arrive, we can only face them together. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends, a city discovering what it is made of. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this case. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here matters. Your engagement tells us that the effort to remember and understand these moments from our shared past is worthwhile. Please like this video if it moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think about the cities we live in and the challenges we face together, and share it with someone who might appreciate this kind of storytelling, someone who cares about history, about community, about what it means to live through difficult times and emerge on the other side. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you will know when the next story is ready. We will continue to bring you narratives that illuminate the past and help us understand the present, stories of storms and struggles, of courage and community, of cities and the people who make them what they are. The blizzard of 1967 is now more than 50 years in the past. The people who lived through it are growing old, and some have already passed on. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was like to wake up on that Thursday morning, to watch the snow begin to fall, to realize slowly that something unprecedented was happening. But the story will remain. It will live in archives and in the memories of those who heard it from their parents and grandparents. It will live in the lessons that urban planners and emergency managers have drawn from the experience. It will live in the awareness, however faint, that the cities we build are never quite as secure as we imagine them to be, and it will live here, in this telling, passed from us to you, in the hope that you will find in it something worth preserving. The storm that blotted out Chicago was also the storm that revealed Chicago, showing the city and its people in a harsh but illuminating light. What they saw in that light was complicated and contradictory, inspiring and troubling, a mixture of human excellence and human failing. That is what cities are. That is what we are. The blizzard of 1967 simply made it visible for a moment. Before the snow melted and the streets cleared, and the ordinary patterns of urban life reasserted themselves, the world went white. And then, eventually, it went back to being the world again, changed by what it had experienced, but continuing nonetheless. That is the story. That is what happened. And that is what it means, to the extent that any of us can say what anything means. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, thank you for being part of this community of people who believe that the past matters, that stories have power, that understanding where we have been can help us navigate where we are going. Until next time, remember, the storms will come, they always do, And when they do, what matters most is how we face them together. The snow remembers, and so do we.